The beam of light cut through darkness, illuminating limestone walls that hadn't seen human presence in decades. Detective Sarah Lawson's breath caught as her flashlight revealed what 22 years of searching had failed to find. A small pink backpack, its fabric weathered but unmistakable, wedged between rocks at the bottom of Caldwell Sinkhole. "We've got something," she radioed, her voice echoing against the cavern walls. "Get the evidence team down here, now." What happened next would shake the quiet town of Millbrook, Kentucky to its core, a community that had spent 2 decades wondering what happened to 5-year-old Kimberly Hayes was about to get answers, and they weren't ready for the truth. Welcome to Cold Case Desk. I'm your host, and today we're diving into a case that proves no secret stays buried forever. In 2001, a child vanished from Millbrook Regional Hospital without a trace. For 22 years, her disappearance tormented a community, destroyed a family, and haunted investigators who couldn't find the missing piece. But in 2023, a breakthrough in DNA technology would finally reveal the truth, and the identity of the killer would send shockwaves through a town where everyone knows everyone. Or at least they thought they did. Before we continue this journey through one of Kentucky's most shocking cold cases, take a second to hit that subscribe button. Cold Case Desk brings you the most compelling solved mysteries every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. The story of Kimberly Hayes begins like any normal day, a routine doctor's appointment on a crisp autumn morning. But what happened in the next 45 minutes would launch a manhunt that would take more than 2 decades to resolve. October 17, 2001. Millbrook Regional Hospital buzzed with the usual Wednesday morning activity. In the pediatric wing, Janet Hayes sat in the waiting room filling out insurance forms while her daughter Kimberly colored quietly beside her. The 5-year-old had been battling recurring ear infections, and this follow-up appointment was supposed to be routine. "Kimberly Hayes?" the nurse called at 10:15 a.m. Janet gathered her paperwork. "Mommy, can I finish my picture?" Kimberly asked, pointing to her half-completed drawing of a horse. "Just stay right here where I can see you," Janet replied. "I'll be right at the desk." It was a decision that would haunt Janet Hayes for the rest of her life. As she spoke with the receptionist about a billing issue just 20 feet away, security cameras captured a figure in scrubs approaching Kimberly. The footage, grainy and captured from an angle, showed the person kneeling beside the child, pointing to her drawing, then leading her by the hand toward the hallway. 3 minutes later, Janet turned back to find an empty chair and an abandoned coloring book. Code Pink, Pediatric Wing. Code Pink, Pediatric Wing. The hospital's child abduction protocol activated immediately, but it was already too late. Kimberly Hayes had vanished from a busy hospital in broad daylight. Sheriff Tom Blackwell arrived within minutes. "We sealed off the hospital faster than we'd ever done for anything," he would later recall in court testimony. "Every exit, every stairwell, every supply closet. We had 50 people searching within the hour." The hospital's security system in 2001 was woefully inadequate by today's standards. Only 4 cameras covered the main areas, with none in the stairwells or secondary exits. The figure in scrubs was never clearly captured on video, and the uniform allowed them to blend seamlessly with hospital staff. By nightfall, the search had expanded beyond the hospital grounds. Volunteers from Millbrook and neighboring counties formed search parties that combed the surrounding woods, abandoned buildings and waterways. Kentucky State Police brought in helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, while K-9 units tracked scents that repeatedly led to the hospital's rear parking lot before going cold. "It was like she just evaporated," said Deputy Maria Cortez, one of the first responders that day. "One minute she's coloring horses in a busy hospital, the next she's gone without a trace." The local news broke into regular programming that evening. A statewide Amber Alert has been issued for 5-year-old Kimberly Hayes, last seen at Millbrook Regional Hospital, wearing a red sweater and blue jeans. Authorities are searching for. The Hayes family appeared at a press conference the following day, their eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Janet Hayes, barely able to stand, pleaded into a forest of microphones. "Please, if you have our daughter, just bring her home. She needs her medication. She has her favorite stuffed rabbit waiting for her. Please." Her husband, David, a construction foreman, stood stoically beside her, his large frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the unknown. "Where are you watching from today? Has your community ever mobilized for a missing person?" The response in Millbrook was unprecedented. Over 1,200 volunteers joined the search within 48 hours. The initial investigation focused on hospital staff and recent visitors. Security footage was enhanced and reviewed frame by frame. The person in scrubs appeared to be of average height, their face always angled away from cameras, suggesting premeditation and knowledge of the surveillance system. Police interviewed 147 hospital employees and checked alibis for everyone who had been in the building that morning. Nothing concrete emerged. No one reported seeing an unfamiliar face. No one noticed anything unusual, except for a janitor who mentioned a service door that had been propped open briefly around 10:30 a.m., though he had assumed it was maintenance staff. As days turned into weeks, the search radius expanded to cover most of eastern Kentucky. Divers checked local ponds and rivers. Cadaver dogs searched dense woodland areas. Flyers with Kimberly's smiling face, showing a gap where she'd recently lost her first tooth, appeared on store windows, gas stations, and telephone poles across 5 counties. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing behavioral analysts who developed a profile. The abduction showed signs of planning and familiarity with the hospital. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. Someone had targeted Kimberly Hayes specifically, or at least targeted the pediatric wing with intent. But why? The Hayes family had no enemies. They weren't wealthy. There was no ransom demand. As the case grew colder, theories multiplied, but evidence remained scarce. By Christmas 2001, the daily searches had dwindled. The command center at the Millbrook fire station gradually emptied. The case remained active, but the trail had gone ice cold. For the Hayes family, time stopped on October 17, 2001. For Millbrook, a shadow had fallen over the community that wouldn't lift for 22 years. Time passes differently when you're waiting for answers. For the Hayes family, the calendar became a cruel reminder of absence, birthdays uncelebrated, milestones unmarked, holidays with an empty chair. "You don't move on," David Hayes told reporters on the 5th anniversary of Kimberly's disappearance. "You just learn to carry it differently as the years pass." The investigation never officially closed, but active leads dwindled to almost nothing by 2003. Detective Marcus Reynolds, the original lead investigator, kept a photo of Kimberly on his desk until his retirement in 2012. The case file, initially bursting with witness statements, search reports, and tips, grew thinner as promising avenues led nowhere. The physical evidence was minimal. The security footage, fingerprints from the waiting room that matched hundreds of hospital visitors, and a single partial footprint in mud outside the service entrance, size 9, possibly from a medical shoe but too degraded for conclusive analysis. In 2006, the Kentucky State Police established their cold case unit, and Kimberly's case was among the first transferred to their jurisdiction. Detective Alicia Winters inherited the file, bringing fresh eyes to evidence that had been reviewed countless times. "Cold cases require patience and perspective," Winters explained in a 2018 interview. "Sometimes the breakthrough isn't new evidence. It's seeing the original evidence in a new light." The Hayes family kept Kimberly's memory alive through annual remembrance walks that started small but grew to attract hundreds of participants. Janet Hayes, once broken by grief, found purpose in advocating for improved hospital security and missing children's legislation. In 2008, the Kimberly Hayes Act passed in Kentucky, requiring enhanced security measures in all pediatric medical facilities, including ID verification, surveillance camera upgrades, and staff training for abduction response. If you're finding this story compelling, give this video a like to help others discover it too. Your engagement helps us bring more solved cold cases to light. Behind the scenes, investigators periodically re-examined the evidence as technology evolved. In 2010, the grainy security footage underwent digital enhancement, revealing more details about the suspect's gait and posture, but still no clear facial features. The case saw brief resurgences of public interest, a segment on a national true crime show in 2011, a podcast series in 2015, a documentary filmmaker's interest in 2019. Each brought a flood of tips, each investigated, each ultimately leading nowhere. David and Janet Hayes divorced in 2013, the strain of their shared tragedy finally breaking what remained of their marriage. David moved to Louisville, but returned for every anniversary walk. Janet remained in the same house, Kimberly's room preserved exactly as it had been, the bed made with horse-patterned sheets, stuffed animals arranged on the pillow, waiting for an owner who never returned. "Some people don't understand why I keep her room this way," Janet said during a rare home interview in 2016. "They think it's unhealthy. But until I know what happened to my daughter, this room stays ready for her." The community of Millbrook changed too. Parents who once let children play freely in front yards became vigilant, suspicious. The hospital installed state-of-the-art security systems and ID protocols. New families moved to town, unaware of the case, until they noticed the small memorial garden outside the elementary school Kimberly would have attended. In 2018, a potential breakthrough emerged when construction workers excavating for a new subdivision discovered human remains in a wooded area 3 miles from the hospital. For 2 agonizing days, the Hayes family waited for identification results. The remains belonged to a missing hiker from 1997, another family's tragedy, not theirs. The cycle of hope and disappointment became familiar. A tip from a prison inmate claiming knowledge of the abduction, a deathbed confession that proved false, a similar case in Tennessee that briefly seemed connected until DNA ruled it out. Through it all, a core group of investigators refused to let Kimberly's case gather dust. They met quarterly to review the file, discuss new forensic possibilities, and keep the investigation alive. They called themselves Kimberly's Guardians, a mix of active and retired law enforcement who had made a pact to find answers. Detective Reynolds, though retired, attended every meeting until his death in 2020. His replacement, Detective Sarah Lawson, inherited his determination along with his case notes. "Marcus believed this case was solvable," Lawson said at his funeral. "He taught me that cold cases aren't about the passage of time, they're about the persistence of truth. Truth doesn't expire." By 2021, the 20th anniversary of Kimberly's disappearance, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. The Remembrance Walk that year drew the largest crowd ever, over 800 people, including law enforcement from across the state. Janet Hayes, now in her 60s, led the procession carrying a lantern symbolizing hope. What no one knew that day was that the breakthrough they had waited for was already taking shape in a laboratory 2 states away, where advances in DNA technology were about to change everything. The truth had been waiting for science to catch up, and in early 2023, it finally did. January 17, 2023. Detective Sarah Lawson sat in the Kentucky State Police Cold Case Unit office, surrounded by case files stacked in neat piles. On her computer screen, an email from the Department of Justice announced expanded funding for cold case DNA testing through a new program called Genetic Justice Initiative. "We can resubmit 5 cases," her supervisor said. "Choose wisely." Kimberly Hayes was her first selection. The original evidence had been meticulously preserved, standard procedure for unsolved cases, but rare to maintain such integrity after 2 decades. The partial footprint, trace fibers from the waiting room chair, and a single dark hair found on Kimberly's abandoned coloring book had all been stored in climate-controlled conditions. In 2001, this evidence yielded little useful information. The hair had no attached root, making traditional DNA analysis impossible. The fibers were common cotton, matching hospital scrubs used by hundreds of employees. The footprint provided only a size and general pattern. But science had evolved dramatically in 22 years. Touch DNA was theoretical when Kimberly disappeared, explained Dr. Eleanor Chen, forensic scientist at Othram Laboratories, which partnered with KSP on the case. Now we can extract DNA profiles from evidence that was once considered impossible to process. The hair without a root, dismissed in 2001, now held promise. Using advanced extraction techniques, scientists could potentially recover DNA from the shaft itself. The coloring book pages, handled by the suspect, might retain microscopic skin cells. Even the footprint cast, sealed in evidence packaging, could contain biological material invisible to earlier testing methods. In March 2023, the evidence arrived at Otham's facility. For 6 weeks, scientists worked to extract usable DNA from these decades-old samples. The process was painstaking, extracting, amplifying, sequencing fragments so degraded they were barely detectable. What time is it where you're watching? Are you staying up late for this case like our investigators did? The breakthrough in this investigation came at 2:17 a.m. after weeks of processing. Detective Lawson, this is Dr. Chen. We have a profile. The hair had yielded a partial DNA sequence, not enough for a traditional CODIS database match, but sufficient for a newer technique that was revolutionizing cold cases across the country. Investigative genetic genealogy. Unlike conventional DNA matching, which requires a suspect's DNA to be in a law enforcement database, IgG uses commercial genealogy databases where people voluntarily upload their DNA profiles to research family history. By finding distant relatives and building family trees, investigators can identify potential suspects who never directly submitted their DNA anywhere. Think of it as working backward through a family tree, Lawson explained to her team. We find distant cousins, then trace their lineages until they intersect with someone who fits our suspect profile. The KSP partnered with a specialized genetic genealogist, Meredith Dawson, who began the painstaking process of building family connections from the partial DNA profile. Starting with several distant matches, third and fourth cousins of the unknown subject, she constructed elaborate family trees spanning generations. For 2 months, Dawson worked virtually around the clock, navigating birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and social media to fill in the branches of multiple family trees. The process narrowed from thousands of possible connections to hundreds, then dozens. The DNA doesn't lie, but the paper trail can be misleading, Dawson noted in her case logs. Adoptions, name changes, undocumented relationships, they all create roadblocks we have to work around. By June 2023, the analysis had produced a short list of 17 individuals who could potentially match the DNA profile. All descended from common ancestors of the distant matches, all potentially in Kentucky during 2001. Investigators began the delicate process of elimination, checking alibis, locations, and connections to Millbrook or its hospital. 14 were quickly ruled out through public records and social media. 3 remained possible. Then came the geographic breakthrough. We need to expand our search area, Lawson told her team during a strategy session. The hospital's rear exit leads to a service road that connects to Route 40. What's along that corridor? A junior detective pulled up topographical maps of the area. Mostly farmland, some woods, and there's Caldwell Sinkhole about 7 miles east. Caldwell Sinkhole, a limestone formation typical in Kentucky's karst landscape, had been searched briefly in 2001 but was considered too dangerous for thorough exploration. Its narrow entrance widened into a network of underground chambers, some reaching depths of 60 feet. Modern equipment made a new search possible. On July 12, 2023, a specialized cave rescue team, equipped with advanced imaging technology, began mapping the sinkhole's interior. On the second day of exploration, in a chamber untouched during the original search, Detective Lawson's flashlight revealed the pink backpack wedged between rocks. The team documented its position meticulously before recovery. Inside, they found a child's red sweater, a small shoe, and a plastic medical bracelet with the name Hayes Kimberly, still legible after 22 years. 2 chambers deeper, they made the discovery the Hayes family had both dreaded and needed: human remains, small enough to belong to a child, preserved in the cool, dry conditions of the cave. "We've found her," Lawson radioed to the surface team. "We're bringing Kimberly home." The medical examiner confirmed the identity through dental records within days. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. The evidence suggested Kimberly had been killed shortly after her abduction and hidden in the sinkhole, which few locals would venture into due to its hazardous reputation. With the recovery site established, investigators focused on the 3 remaining suspects from the genetic genealogy analysis. One name rose to the top: Edward Mercer, 58, a former hospital maintenance worker who had lived in Millbrook until 2004 before moving to Cincinnati. Mercer's employment records showed he had access to all areas of the hospital in 2001, including the service entrance near where Kimberly disappeared. His work schedule placed him at the hospital that morning. Most significantly, his family tree aligned perfectly with the DNA matches, but they needed his DNA to confirm. A surveillance team tracked Mercer in Cincinnati, collecting discarded coffee cups, cigarette butts, and a straw from his lunch. The samples went directly to the lab for rush processing. On August 3, 2023, Dr. Chen called Detective Lawson again. "It's a match. 15 genetic markers in common with the hair sample. The statistical probability exceeds 1 in 10 million. Within hours, an arrest warrant was issued. The next morning, Cincinnati police and KSP officers surrounded Mercer's apartment building as he left for work. "Edward Mercer, this is the police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Kimberly Hayes." The man who had eluded justice for 22 years offered no resistance. As officers handcuffed him, a neighbor filmed the arrest on her phone, capturing the moment that would soon shock an entire community. Because Edward Mercer wasn't just any former hospital worker. In Cincinnati, he had rebuilt his life, becoming a respected member of his church, a Little League coach, and a volunteer at a children's hospital. The monster they had been hunting had been hiding in plain sight all along. Edward Mercer's booking photo appeared on news stations across Kentucky by nightfall. The face staring back at viewers was unremarkable: grey-haired, glasses, slight smile lines around the eyes. He looked like someone's grandfather, not a child killer. That's what makes these cases so disturbing, FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Rebecca Torres explained in a press conference. The monsters rarely look like monsters. The arrest sent shockwaves through 2 communities. In Cincinnati, neighbors and colleagues struggled to reconcile the man they knew, quiet, helpful, always willing to volunteer, with the horrific allegations. In Millbrook, residents who remembered the soft-spoken maintenance man experienced a different kind of shock. He had been among them all along, even joining search parties for Kimberly in 2001. Breaking tonight. An arrest in the 2001 kidnapping and murder of 5-year-old Kimberly Hayes. The suspect, Edward Mercer, worked at Millbrook Regional Hospital when Kimberly disappeared and reportedly participated in community searches for the missing child. As investigators dug into Mercer's background, a disturbing portrait emerged. Born in 1965 in eastern Kentucky, he had moved between maintenance jobs at 6 different hospitals across 3 states. His employment at Millbrook Regional began just 8 months before Kimberly's abduction. His personnel file contained no red flags, no complaints, no disciplinary actions. Performance reviews described him as reliable, keeps to himself, and knows the building better than anyone. He had access to all areas, including security camera monitoring rooms, and worked shifts that familiarized him with hospital routines. "He was invisible in the best way possible," explained former hospital administrator Helen Winters. "Maintenance staff often are. They have keys to everything, but nobody really notices them." Mercer had lived alone in a small rental house on Millbrook's outskirts. Neighbors recalled little about him, except that he kept his yard tidy and sometimes fixed their appliances. After Kimberly's disappearance, he continued working at the hospital for nearly 3 years before relocating to Cincinnati in 2004, citing his mother's declining health as the reason. No one questioned his departure. No one connected him to the case. In Cincinnati, Mercer reinvented himself. He secured another maintenance position at an office building, joined a church, and gradually built a reputation as a community-minded bachelor. By 2010, he was coaching youth baseball and volunteering at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, a detail that chilled investigators to the bone. Photos from his Cincinnati life showed a man who had integrated perfectly into his surroundings, smiling with his Little League team, receiving a Volunteer Appreciation Award, standing beside colleagues at charity events. This is the profile we see repeatedly. in long-term offenders who evade capture, Dr. Torres noted. They create a protective identity, often one that positions them as helpful, trustworthy, even selfless. It's both camouflage and a form of psychological management. The search of Mercer's Cincinnati apartment yielded nothing incriminating. No trophies from Kimberly, no evidence of other victims, no child-related materials. His computer contained only ordinary browsing history. His life appeared meticulously normal, but in the basement of his former Millbrook rental, now occupied by a young family, investigators made a disturbing discovery. Behind a false wall in a storage area, they found a small space containing a child-sized mattress, toys, and girls' clothing from the early 2000s. This case shows how technology is changing cold case investigations. Comment below with other cold cases you think could be solved with today's technology. In custody, Mercer maintained absolute silence, requesting a lawyer immediately. His court-appointed attorney, Deborah Rankin, issued only a brief statement. Mr. Mercer asserts his innocence and looks forward to examining the evidence against him in a proper legal setting. The evidence, however, continued mounting. Forensic analysis of Mercer's former work locker at Millbrook Hospital, preserved during a 2015 renovation, revealed microscopic blood spatter matching Kimberly's DNA. The hospital's archived maintenance logs showed Mercer had requested access to the service entrance area for repair work on the day of the abduction. Most damning was the testimony of a former co-worker who remembered Mercer mentioning knowledge of Caldwell Sinkhole, describing it as nature's perfect hiding place during a lunch conversation about local geography. As news of these discoveries spread, both communities struggled with painful questions. How had he hidden in plain sight for so long? Had there been signs everyone missed? Could he have had other victims? A town hall meeting in Millbrook drew hundreds of residents seeking answers. Sheriff Blackwell, now retired, addressed the crowd with visible emotion. "We looked everywhere except right beside us. That's the hardest truth we have to face." In Cincinnati, parents whose children had been coached by Mercer or encountered him at the hospital underwent a different kind of trauma, examining every interaction, every photograph, searching for signs they might have missed. Authorities established a hotline for concerns, though no evidence of additional victims emerged. Psychologists called it community trauma, the collective shock and betrayal when someone embedded within a social fabric is revealed as something monstrous. "He took more than Kimberly," Janet Hayes told reporters after viewing Mercer's booking photo. "He took our community's trust, our sense of safety. He watched us grieve while knowing exactly what he'd done." As prosecutors built their case, a disturbing theory emerged about Mercer's possible motive. Hospital records showed he had been on duty during each of Kimberly's previous appointments for ear infections. Security footage from those earlier visits, long since overwritten but described in staff interviews, suggested he had observed the Hayes family multiple times. This wasn't random, Commonwealth Attorney Maria Delgado explained in a preliminary hearing. Evidence suggests the defendant developed a fixation on the victim over multiple encounters, learning her routines and planning the abduction. The man who had spent 22 years building a life of careful normalcy now sat in a cell at Kentucky State Penitentiary, his facade finally shattered. The community that had searched for a monster now had to reconcile with the fact that he had been searching alongside them all along. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood imposing against the Kentucky sky as Edward Mercer made his first appearance before Judge William Hargrove on August 10, 2023. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit, hands and feet shackled, the former maintenance worker kept his eyes downcast as the charges were read: kidnapping, first-degree murder, and tampering with physical evidence. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Hargrove asked. "Not guilty, Your Honor," responded defense attorney Deborah Rankin. The plea was standard procedure, but it sent ripples of disbelief through the packed courtroom where Janet Hayes sat in the front row, clutching a small rabbit-stuffed animal, identical to the one Kimberly had loved. Commonwealth Attorney Maria Delgado requested Mercer be held without bail, citing flight risk and the severity of the charges. Judge Hargrove agreed, remanding Mercer to custody pending trial. What followed was the beginning of a complex legal battle that would test the boundaries of forensic science in Kentucky's courts. The case against Mercer rested heavily on the DNA evidence and genetic genealogy, a relatively new investigative technique that had never been tested at trial in Kentucky. "We're in uncharted legal territory," explained legal analyst Cameron Wright. Investigative genetic genealogy has helped solve over 200 cold cases nationwide, but most resulted in confessions or plea deals. Few have faced the scrutiny of a full trial. Defense attorney Rankin immediately filed motions challenging the admissibility of the genealogical evidence, arguing it constituted an unreasonable search under the Fourth Amendment and violated the privacy rights of the distant relatives whose DNA had led to Mercer. "The prosecution wants to use a family tree as a search warrant," Rankin argued in pre-trial hearings. "My client never consented to have his DNA analyzed, nor did he upload genetic information to any database. The state is attempting to circumvent constitutional protections through biological connections." Prosecutor Delgado countered that the initial DNA collection from discarded items in public spaces followed established legal precedent. The Supreme Court has consistently held there's no expectation of privacy for abandoned property. Mr. Mercer voluntarily discarded these items in public trash receptacles. As the legal arguments unfolded in court, the case captured national attention. Legal scholars, privacy advocates, and victims' rights groups filed amicus briefs. The Department of Justice, which had funded the testing through its Genetic Justice Initiative, closely monitored proceedings that could set precedent for hundreds of similar cases. What's the weather like where you are today? Here in Kentucky, weather played a crucial role in evidence preservation. The cool, dry conditions of Caldwell Sinkhole protected critical evidence for over 2 decades. Media descended on Millbrook, transforming the quiet town into the epicenter of a national conversation about justice, technology, and privacy. Satellite trucks lined Main Street. Reporters conducted interviews outside the courthouse, the hospital, and the memorial garden dedicated to Kimberly. Through it all, Janet Hayes maintained a dignified silence, attending every hearing but declining interviews. David Hayes, now remarried and living in Louisville, joined her in court. The former couple united by their shared determination to see justice for their daughter. On October 3, 2023, Judge Hargrove delivered his ruling on the admissibility of the genetic genealogy evidence. It would be allowed, with specific limitations on how it could be presented to a jury. While this court acknowledges the novel nature of this investigative technique, Hargrove wrote in his 42-page opinion, the fundamental scientific principles underlying DNA analysis are well established and meet the Dober standard for scientific evidence. The genealogical methods used to narrow potential suspects represent investigative techniques rather than evidence itself. With this hurdle cleared, prosecutors presented the case to a grand jury, which returned an indictment on all charges. Trial was set for February 2024. As the legal machinery advanced, investigators continued building their case. Forensic analysis of soil samples from Mercer's work boots, preserved in his former Millbrook home's attic, matched the unique mineral composition of Caldwell Sinkhole. Cell phone records, though limited by 2001 technology, placed Mercer's phone inactive during the critical hours after Kimberly's disappearance, a deviation from his normal usage patterns. The prosecution also developed a timeline that explained how Mercer could have abducted Kimberly without being noticed. As a maintenance worker, he knew the hospital's blind spots and shift changes. His access to service areas provided routes to avoid security. His knowledge of the building's mechanical systems even allowed him to temporarily disable a security camera by triggering a false maintenance alert. On January 15, 2024, in a move that stunned observers, Rankin filed notice that Mercer wished to change his plea. A hearing was scheduled for the following week. The courtroom fell silent as Edward Mercer rose on January 22nd. Judge Hargrove asked if he understood the rights he was waiving by pleading guilty. "I do, Your Honor," Mercer replied, his voice barely audible. "And how do you plead to the charges of kidnapping and murder of Kimberly Hayes?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Janet Hayes closed her eyes, her hand tightening around the stuffed rabbit. The plea agreement spared Mercer the death penalty in exchange for a full confession and sentence of life without possibility of parole. For the first time, the full truth of what happened on October 17, 2001 would finally be revealed. Not through evidence and testimony, but from the perpetrator himself. The Jefferson County Courthouse was filled beyond capacity on February 7, 2024, as Edward Mercer stood for sentencing. The plea agreement required him to provide a full account of his crimes before the court determined his fate. For 23 minutes, in a flat, emotionless voice, Mercer detailed how he had observed Kimberly during her previous hospital visits, developed an obsession, and meticulously planned the abduction. He described using his maintenance uniform to approach her, leading her through service corridors to his vehicle, and driving to Caldwell Sinkhole, a location he had scouted weeks earlier. Janet Hayes remained stoic throughout the confession, her eyes never leaving Mercer's face. David Hayes wept silently beside her. When Mercer described Kimberly's final moments, several jurors and even veteran court officers looked away. Judge Hargrove's voice cut through the silence that followed. "Mr. Mercer, you have admitted to crimes that defy comprehension. You stole a child from her family, from her future, from everything she might have become. You then watched that family suffer for 22 years while building a life for yourself." The judge paused, removing his glasses. "This court sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, to be served at Kentucky State Penitentiary. May you use your remaining years to reflect on the immeasurable harm you have caused." As officers led Mercer away, Janet Hayes stood. In a voice steady and clear, she addressed him directly. "I've carried the weight of that day for 22 years. Now it's your turn to carry it." It was the only statement she made in court. Outside the courthouse, Commonwealth Attorney Delgado addressed the media. "Today brings a measure of justice for Kimberly Hayes and her family. This case demonstrates that no matter how much time passes, no matter how cold a case becomes, we will never stop seeking the truth." Detective Sarah Lawson stood nearby, the weight of the case visible in her posture. When asked about the investigation, she redirected attention. "This moment isn't about law enforcement. It's about a little girl who deserved to grow up, and a family that deserved to watch her do it." For Millbrook, the resolution brought complicated emotions, relief mixed with renewed grief, closure intertwined with painful questions about how a predator had moved among them undetected for years. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who appreciates true crime storytelling, and don't forget to subscribe for more solved cold cases. 1 month after the sentencing, over 1,500 people gathered at Millbrook Elementary School for the dedication of Kimberly's Garden, an expanded memorial featuring a playground, reading nook, and butterfly sanctuary. Janet Hayes cut the ribbon, surrounded by the investigators, volunteers, and community members who had kept her daughter's case alive for more than 2 decades. "This garden represents more than remembrance," Janet said in brief remarks. "It represents resilience. It reminds us that truth may be delayed, but it cannot be permanently hidden." The impact of the case extended far beyond Millbrook. The Kentucky legislature passed the Hayes-Reynolds Act, named for Kimberly and the detective who never gave up on her case, allocating permanent funding for cold case investigations and creating a dedicated DNA evidence preservation program. Hospitals across the country reviewed their security protocols, particularly around pediatric units. The Department of Justice expanded its Genetic Justice Initiative, providing resources for hundreds of similar cold cases nationwide. In law schools, the case became required reading for courses on forensic evidence and constitutional law. The judge's ruling on genetic genealogy evidence established precedent that would influence investigations for years to come. For the Hayes family, justice brought a different kind of healing. Janet and David, though no longer married, found a new connection through their shared journey. Together, they established the Kimberly Hayes Foundation, which supports families of missing children and advocates for advanced forensic testing in cold cases. "We couldn't save our daughter," David explained at the foundation's launch, "but her case might help save others." On October 17, 2023, 22 years to the day after Kimberly disappeared, She was finally laid to rest in Millbrook Cemetery. The small pink casket was covered with flowers from across the country. The stuffed rabbit that had waited on her bed for 2 decades was tucked inside with her. Detective Sarah Lawson placed her badge on the casket momentarily before it was lowered into the ground, a silent promise kept. As the community dispersed from the graveside, Janet Hayes remained, watching the sunset paint the Kentucky hills in shades of gold and crimson. A reporter who had covered the case from the beginning approached hesitantly. "Mrs. Hayes, after all this time, all the searching, what do you feel now?" Janet considered the question, her gaze still on the horizon. "I feel like I can finally say her name without it being a question," she replied. "Kimberly. Not, where is Kimberly? Just Kimberly."